In this video, I want to show off an early release of a Grafana plugin that we have developed to interact with or integrate with Octopus and to display metrics about deployments and other entities in the Octopus server. So what I have here is a blank instance of Grafana installed on a local Ubuntu 2004 VM. And to get started, we need to install the plugin. So that's available from this URL here. This is just the GitHub repository for this code, and I'll paste a link to that in the blog post. And the releases or the plugin can be found under this releases panel here. So it's this zip file here that we'll need to download. And so I'll just save that to my downloads directory. And to install it, I need to unzip this this file into the plugins directory of Grafana. And so that's actually this directory here, which I don't have access to without sudo. So it's empty at the moment. And so what we'll do is just go to my home. And then, so that's the directory where I download the zip file, and then I'll just extract that file to a directory under the plugins directory called Octopus. So if we look here now, we can see those. The plugin has been extracted. To have the second thing we need to do actually is allow Grafana to use an unsigned plugin. So because of the way this plugin has been distributed, it's not considered to be signed, and we do need to have a we need to edit one of the configuration files to allow that to be loaded by Grafana. And so to do that, we edit the grafana.ini file. I'll look for unsigned. So this setting here is the one we need to edit to allow the plugin to work. And if I look back here in the README, we can see the setting that needs to be set. And that's this one here. So under the plugins heading, we just need to list this the Octopus plugin as being allowed to be used. So I'll just save those changes, and then we can restart the Grafana server to load the new plugin. So if I go back to Grafana here, I'll just refresh to make sure that it's up. And we're all good. We go into the data sources section here. And then down the bottom, we will have the new unsigned plugin available to be used. So I'm going to select that. So there's two fields that we need to configure for the data source. First one is the URL of your Octopus instance, and in this case, I'm just pointing to a hosted instance that we use internally. And then you'll also need the API key. So if I hit save and test here, we can see that the data source has successfully connected out to the Octopus server, and we're good to go. So to get started quickly, we will actually just import a sample dashboard that we've already configured and is publicly available at this link here. So this sample dashboard is something you can import directly into Grafana by pasting the URL here and clicking the load button. So I just need to point it to the data source that I had configured earlier, and we can click import. So there's a couple of things you'll notice about this this dashboard. First is that you get these drop downs up the top. These are variables, dashboard variables. And they're populated straight from the Octopus instance. So here I've selected a space called Octofront, selected an environment called Octofront, production, and then a project called Octofront. And you can see as you select these different options, the dashboard will actually go ahead and refresh itself. So there's a bunch of graphs and tiles here that show off the state of our Octopus server. These ones in blue, they're just straightforward counts of the different types of entities that are in this particular space. So we have 8 environments, 2 projects, 3 workables, for example. These other ones, the 6 over here, are calculations of some average metrics. So what we have here is the percentage of deployments that failed in this particular environment for this particular project. Time to recovery is measured by the a failed deployment, the time difference between a failed deployment and the next successful deployment for the same project environment and tenant and channel, actually. And so here we have the minimum time. So the quickest recovery here for this project was 28 minutes. And the longest time between a failed deployment and a successful deployment was 1.5 days. We can see just some counts of deployments. We've had 16 failed and 109 successful. And the average duration of each deployment is about 6 minutes. The charts down here show some of those same values, but spread out over time. So in this chart here, we can see the counts of deployments to the Dev A environment, green being successful deployments, and in this case, red being failures. These bars here are stacked over the time bucket that they represent, so you can get an idea of the relative counts of successful and failed deployments. This chart here shows the average duration of the deployments. As we can see, it's kind of hovering around that, well, around the 6-minute mark, as we know the average duration is about 6 minutes. Time to recover. So this is the time it takes for the difference between a failed deployment and the next successful deployment. What we can see here is most of these deployments have recovered fairly quickly. So these 2 little bars here would represent the successful deployment that happens after these 2 failed deployments here. This failed deployment here obviously took quite a bit of time between the next one. And so that represents here. And as we can see, there's no successful or failed deployments for probably maybe a day after that. And then these 2 here have succeeded fairly quickly after the initial failure. Lead time, release lead time, is the time between the creation of the release and its deployment to this particular environment. So what we can see here is that there's probably around 8 or 9 minute average time between a release being created and it being deployed to Dev A. We should see that number increase as we move up to the production environment. Yeah, and as we can see that we're now measuring in hours or possibly days between the time that a release was created and that it was actually deployed to production. So I just want to go through some of the other features of the plugin that people should find useful. And one is the ability to extract variables. And so these 3 variables here were the 3 drop downs that you see here. And these are used for making the charts generic and something you can select for your own particular needs. So if we actually go and have a look at the configuration of one of these charts or tiles, we can see that we use the variable space in this case for a simple chart that displays a space level value. Or if we go down to one of these ones, we can see that space, project, and environment are all filters used by this particular graph. And so they work. They're fairly easy to use. Just click new here. Let's say we wanted a list of tenants, for example. This name here would then become a variable that you can use in your queries. You just append it with a $sign to reference the variable. Query is the type of variable that we need to use here, and we select our Octopus Deploy data source. So we're going to select tenants, and in this case, we want to select the tenants from the space that we'd selected previously. So notice how I use the dollar and then the name of the variable. Actually, tenants is probably not a good one. There's no tenants in this particular space. So I'll select environment here, and you can see as my mouse moves out of that drop down, it refreshes and gives us a list of the values. So if I do say projects, you have the list of projects. There may or may not be any channels. Oh, there are. So there's 3 channels there. Let's call this channels. So if we return back to the dashboard, you can see now that the available channels options that we can select as a way of specifying the particular filters that are available, or the variable that is available to the queries here. And so you would use this one, this new variable, like so. You would reference it here with the $sign in front, and then the name of the variable there. I won't actually change that, but I just wanted to show off how those variables work. So one thing that is worth looking at are the options available on the query, I guess you can create with this data source. So the first one defines the type of results that you get. So the deployments time series is a list of deployments grouped into time buckets, and that's suitable for displaying in charts like this. What you can actually see, if we go to a table view, you get to see the actual results that are being returned. As you can see, most of these time buckets are usually empty. Unless you have a particularly active project, you expect to have a couple of empty time buckets there. These time buckets here have obviously been populated with a couple of results, in this case 5 failures and 1 success. So the time series is suitable for these kind of graphs here. You actually get a table view. It's not very useful for a graph here. Actually, I don't think it will even get anything. It'll just show up empty, and that's because there's no it's just not suitable for those particular types of charts. You'd normally use a table with the actual table graph type here, or visualization here. And so this is more of a flat table, and this is actually very close to the kind of data you would get if you queried the Octopus API directly. There's a bunch more of these table options here, and these return the entities that make up or that are present in a particular Octopus space. So for example, if you look at projects, down here, the filter, so we're filtering the results by the currently selected space. As we can see, we get those 2, and that actually matches what we see here, these 2 here. These probably, the only real use of these entity table results for these aggregate kind of just overall counts that we have here. And so these are useful if you just want to keep an eye on how many environments are being created, and just make sure that those numbers aren't blowing out to be too big. So if I go back to the time series, this is the one that has the most options for filtering. So these filters mean that the results have to match the text that's entered here, or the variable that's been selected. And so in this case, we're filtering the results by space, by project name, and by environment name. You could also further limit it by channel names, tenant names, release version filters, and task state. So that's things like failed or timed out, and you can limit it down by that. These switches here allow you to turn values on and off. So you'll note if I go back to graph view, I refresh. So you'll notice these 4 fields are available, and that matches these 4 that have been enabled. I mean, this particular graph here was only designed to show the success or failed deployments. We weren't really interested here in durations or time to recovery, and so that's why these values have been switched off. If you switch them back on, they appear automatically in the chart, and to work around that, you'd have to maybe shift click on these options down the bottom to hide or show the options. But if you know you're not going to need them, it's just easier to have them turned off and not returned at all in the data set. And so that's why those have been switched off. So these two, the cycle time fields are worth calling out. So if you recall well, actually it should be called the deployment lead time. And this value is the duration between when the release is created and when the deployment has successfully finished or failed. And this has a little bit of an overhead in that it requires a few more API calls back to Octopus in order to calculate that value. I mean, it's terrible, but if you don't need those values, you should definitely not enable them, and that will increase the performance of the query. So one thing that is interesting, and it's a new feature in Grafana 7, are these transforms. And so these are ways of modifying the results or calculating different values from a data set. So traditionally, Grafana has relied on the data set itself to do all the heavy lifting as far as calculating values. So you can imagine if you're querying a SQL database, for example, you'd use a lot of SQL to generate calculated values. And so this feature in, I think it's new in 7 actually, Grafana 7, opens up some interesting possibilities as far as kind of calculating different values. And so this percentage here is not actually something returned natively by the data set. It's something that we've actually calculated from the values that we have available. And it's a little bit tricky, like it's a little bit, it's not quite as straightforward as it might seem to get these values. So I thought I'd run through and show you how I managed to get the percentage here. So what I'll do is actually just delete all of these. So we start from scratch. So the first thing to do, well, the first thing that I found was useful was to switch to a table view. This view gives you a nice representation of how you're modifying the data as you're changing it. And so what we want to do first up is use reduce. And so this is like your group by in SQL. It takes all of these values and condenses them down into some aggregate, like max, min, mean or last, so you can get averages or the maximum or minimum values. And so in this case, what we want to do is get the total. And so total is the sum of all the values. And so these columns here, success and failure, will either be a 1 or a 0, depending on whether the deployment was a success or a failure. And so what we want to do is calculate all of the successes and all of the failures and get those total values. So if I click, actually I should point out the reason why these percentages is this option here. So I'll actually just go and change that to none. So we can just see the raw value. We'll go back and change it to percent later. But for now, we just want to represent the raw values. So if I go to total, we can see that the time series has now been collapsed down to these two fields, the total count of success, which is 43, and the total count of failure. Also, we have the field, obviously the name of the particular total shown in this column here. And that's not ideal. We don't want this field. These numbers, well, these values don't mean anything to our calculation. So what we'll actually do is get rid of that by going using this filter by name. And if we just click disable the field, we can now see that our table is 2 rows, 1 column, and first row, I should say, being the successes, and the second row being the failures. So in order to do a calculation on both of these numbers side by side, what we actually need to do is collapse again these 2 rows down into 1. And to do that, we'll use reduce again. What we'll do is take the first value, which was our successes, and we'll take our last value, which was our failures. And so you can see how we now have a single row with 3 columns, the second column being a count of our successes and the third column being a count of our failures. So at this point, we can do basically math operations on these. So what we want to do is divide the failures by the success to get the percentage of failures. So to do that, we add a field from calculation. And we use this binary operation, which basically just means you can perform maths on it. And so what we want to do is take the last and divide it by the first. And then we can see we now have the result of that particular calculation. So to display that in a visualization like a gauge or a stat here, we really just want, again, a single result. We don't want these first 3 columns anymore. And so again, to do that, we filter by name. So turn off field, turn off first, and we'll turn off last. And so we now have our percentage. If I go to stat, we can see, well, we have a decimal. We don't really have a percentage, but that is where the this unit under the field tab here comes in handy. So what we want to do is select percentage, and this option here, the 0.0, can't really see it, but I think that goes up to 0.0 through to 1.0. Actually, that tooltip just showed me. Yeah, there we go. So if I click that, we get the percentage. And that's how we can take a time series set of results and essentially distill it down into a single value like a percentage. And that's how we've calculated the failed deployments here. So that is it. That is all I wanted to show for our dashboard here. We've made this available as an early access. We do expect a couple of bugs and some missing functionality, but hopefully you can still get some value and see the potential of this. And if you do have any issues or have any suggestions about how to improve it, just reach out to our support teams. You can find them at octopus.com/support, and we'll certainly do our best to resolve any issues or add any suitable functionality. Thanks for listening, and if you have any comments on this, feel free to reach out in the comments section on the associated blog post. Thanks a lot.